Have you ever felt lonely, even while lying next to someone you love? Not abandoned, not rejected, just quietly unseen. The kind of loneliness that doesn't arrive with conflict or raised voices, but settles in gently, like dust on familiar furniture. It's easy to miss, especially when everything on the outside appears stable, even good. Chito lives inside that kind of life. She has a family, a home that functions smoothly, and days that move forward without obvious disruption. Mornings begin the same way, waking early, preparing breakfast, organizing small responsibilities that keep the household running. There is nothing traumatic here, no crisis, no clear fracture, just repetition. And over time, repetition begins to feel less like structure and more like weight. What Chito notices first is not unhappiness, but fatigue, a quiet mental tiredness that lingers even after rest. Conversations at home are efficient, practical, focused on logistics rather than feelings. Nothing is wrong, yet something essential feels absent. Emotional connection has not disappeared. It has simply grown faint, like a radio signal, slowly fading into static. Psychologically, this is a common space many people occupy without realizing it. When life becomes predictable, the mind often shifts into survival mode. We complete tasks, fulfill roles, and meet expectations, but we stop checking in with our inner experience. Chito doesn't feel angry. She doesn't feel betrayed. She feels unacknowledged, even by herself. Then there are the mornings. Ordinary, forgettable mornings when she takes out the trash before the day fully begins. In these brief pauses between private life and public space, she crosses paths with Ken, a security guard at the apartment complex. Their exchanges are short, polite, sometimes just a greeting, sometimes a comment about the weather or the quiet of early hours. Nothing about these conversations is dramatic. That is precisely why they matter. Ken exists outside Chito's daily emotional routine. He doesn't know her history or her roles. In these brief interactions, she is not defined as a wife, a caretaker, or a problem solver. She is simply a person being acknowledged. And for Ken, these moments offer something similar, a small human connection that interrupts the monotony of standing watch, observing other people's lives from a distance. These encounters are not about romance or escape. They are about recognition, about what happens when two people, without intention or expectation, create a moment of presence. The mind responds to that presence because it fulfills a basic psychological need to be seen without judgment, without demand. Chito doesn't notice the shift immediately. She only senses that these mornings feel lighter, that something inside her has been gently stirred awake. And without realizing it, she begins to question a thought she has carried for a long time, that feeling disconnected is simply the price of stability. That question lingers quietly as her routine continues. At home, everything still works. Meals are prepared. Schedules align. Responsibilities are met. Yet emotional exchange feels increasingly transactional, reduced to efficiency. There is no hostility, but there is also no curiosity. No one is asking, "How are you really?" And over time, the absence of that question can feel heavier than open conflict. When feelings are not expressed, The mind often interprets silence as disinterest, even when that was never the intention. Chito begins to internalize this emotional distance. Instead of naming it, she minimizes it. She tells herself that this is simply what adulthood looks like. That stability requires restraint. That wanting more connection is indulgent or unrealistic. Meanwhile, the brief conversations with Ken remain unchanged in content, but deepen in impact. He listens in a way that is rare, not intensely, not invasively, but with genuine presence. When Chito speaks, even casually, she feels heard. That experience doesn't solve anything, but it creates contrast. And contrast is powerful. It highlights what has been missing without explicitly naming it. From Ken's perspective, there is also an internal struggle. His role places him on the periphery of other people's lives. He observes routines, but rarely participates in them. These exchanges with Chito remind him that he, too, is more than his function. Yet he remains careful, instinctively maintaining boundaries. Not because of rules, but because of respect for her life and for his own values. This is where discomfort quietly enters the story. Chito begins to notice that she looks forward to these brief interactions, not for escape, but for relief. And that realization unsettles her. The mind often reacts with guilt when it detects emotional reliance forming outside familiar structures. She questions herself. Why does something so small feel so significant? What does that say about the life she returns to after these moments end? This tension is not about desire, it's about unmet emotional regulation. Humans seek environments where they feel calm, validated, and understood. When those conditions are scarce in one area of life, the nervous system naturally responds to places where they exist, even briefly. This is not a moral failure. It is a biological response. At the same time, Chito avoids addressing the growing distance at home. Avoidance feels safer than confrontation, especially when there is no clear conflict to point to. How do you explain feeling lonely when nothing is technically wrong? How do you articulate an absence? Chito remains physically present in her family life, but emotionally divided, not between people, but between who she is and who she feels allowed to be. And beneath all of this lies a quiet fear that acknowledging her inner disconnection might disrupt the fragile balance she has worked so hard to maintain. The moment of realization does not arrive with confrontation. There is no dramatic scene, no raised voices, no irreversible choice. Instead, it arrives quietly, the way most meaningful insights do, through an accumulation of small emotional signals that finally become impossible to ignore. One morning, the exchange with Ken feels different, not because of what is said, but because of what Chito feels afterward. The familiar lightness fades more quickly, replaced by a subtle heaviness. She becomes aware that the relief she has been experiencing is temporary, almost borrowed. It doesn't follow her home. It doesn't settle into her life. It simply highlights the contrast, then disappears. Chito realizes that these moments, while gentle and human, are not solutions. They are reflections. They mirror a need she has been postponing, her need to be emotionally present in her own life, not just functional within it. The discomfort she feels is not about crossing boundaries, but about standing too long at their edge. Ken senses the shift as well. He notices Chito's hesitation, the way her responses become more measured, more inward. He does not ask questions. He does not press for closeness. Instead, he respects the pause. Chito realizes she values safety, not escape the comfort of being heard without expectation. At home, silence had slowly replaced vulnerability, mistaken for peace. This awareness brings clarity, not blame. This connection becomes a signal, not a failure. Choosing to speak honestly, she prepares to invite connection back into her life. Chito's story is not a warning, but a quiet invitation to see emotional distance as a signal rather than a failure. Loneliness in an otherwise stable relationship often doesn't mean love is gone. It means emotional care has been neglected. Like any living space, relationships require presence to remain healthy. Her experience shows that humans regulate emotions through connection. When feeling heard becomes rare, the mind naturally seeks relief, not to replace what exists, but to understand what's missing. The lesson is responsibility without self-blame. Emotional discomfort is information, not accusation. If you feel emotionally distant in a relationship that otherwise appears stable, the first step is not action. It is awareness. Ask yourself what you have stopped expressing, what questions you no longer ask, what parts of yourself you have learned to quiet in order to keep things running smoothly. Feeling lonely does not mean you are alone. It means you are human. And when that feeling is met with honesty, empathy, and courage, it can become the beginning of deeper connection where it matters most. Begin with awareness. Notice what you've stopped expressing, the questions left unasked, the parts of yourself quieted for the sake of peace. Communication doesn't need drama, just small, honest truths. Ultimately, feeling lonely doesn't mean you're broken or alone. It means you're human, and honesty can turn that feeling into reconnection where it matters most.